What happens when a man quietly takes over the kitchen, the garden, and even the farm, just to see the woman he loves smile again? Today's story is not about big drama, but about small moments that heal. Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore a gentle, heartwarming episode where laughter returns through simple acts of love. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Morning arrived slowly, the kind of morning that did not rush anyone out of bed. The house felt calm, settled into the hillside like it had been there forever. Light slipped through the curtains in thin lines, touching the wooden floor, the edge of the table, the corner of the wall. Outside, birds called to each other lazily, not urgent, not loud, just present. Linda woke up to a sound she did not recognize. It was not loud, but it was steady. A soft clatter, something being placed down and picked up again. A pause, then a quiet sigh, followed by movement once more. She lay still for a moment, listening. Another sound followed, a pan scraping gently, a drawer opening too fast and closing again, someone clearing his throat. Linda smiled before she even opened her eyes. She turned onto her side and pushed herself up slowly, careful with her movements. The floor was cool beneath her feet as she stood. When she stepped into the hallway, the smell reached her immediately. Warm, slightly smoky, not burnt, but close enough to suggest effort rather than experience. Someone was cooking. Linda stopped just short of the kitchen. Quang stood in front of the stove, his back straight, shoulders tense, like a man standing before a task he had promised himself to finish. One sleeve of his shirt was rolled neatly, the other barely touched his wrist. His hair was a little messy, as if he had already run his fingers through it more than once. A pan sat on the stove with eggs inside, cooked longer than planned, but still holding together. A pot next to it bubbled softly, patient and forgiving. He had not noticed her yet. Linda leaned lightly against the doorframe and watched him. She didn't speak right away. She let herself stay in the moment, watching the way he leaned closer to the stove, the way he hesitated before touching the handle again, the way he exhaled slowly, like he was reminding himself to stay calm. "Are you cooking?" she asked gently, "or negotiating with the kitchen?" Quang startled and turned too fast. The spoon in his hand hit the counter with a soft clang. "Linda," he laughed under his breath. "You're awake." "I woke up because the kitchen sounded nervous." He shook his head, embarrassed but smiling. "I wanted to finish before you came out." She stepped closer and looked into the pan. "That egg has lived a full life." "I lost track of time." "You lost track of heat." He lowered the flame carefully. "I'm still learning." Linda laughed and moved to the table, sitting down slowly. She rested her hands on the edge of the table and watched him work, her expression relaxed, amused, warm. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know," he replied without hesitation, "but I wanted to." A few minutes later, he placed a plate in front of her. The food was simple: toast slightly uneven, eggs imperfect. It looked like something made with attention, not confidence. She took a bite. Her shoulders dropped almost immediately. "It's good," she said. "Really?" Quang stopped what he was doing. "You're not just saying that?" "I wouldn't lie this early." The relief on his face made her smile even wider. He sat across from her and watched her eat, not speaking, as if he didn't want to interrupt the moment. When she finished, Linda stood out of habit and reached for the dishes. "No," Quang said immediately. She paused. No, I'll do it. She raised an eyebrow. Since when? Since today. And tomorrow? He shrugged. Tomorrow too. Linda laughed and sat back down. Then I'll supervise. He washed slowly, water splashing onto the counter more than necessary. When a plate slipped slightly in his hands, Linda gasped. Careful, that plate has plans. You're enjoying this, he said. I really am. Later that morning, Quang picked up a bucket and headed outside. I'll feed the chickens. I'll watch, Linda said, following him to the doorway. The moment he scattered the feed, the chickens rushed him without hesitation. One flapped aggressively, another pecked his shoe. Hey, easy, he said, stepping back. Linda burst out laughing. He turned, half defensive. Linda, I'm sorry, she said between laughs. I really am, but you look so serious. One chicken chased him 2 full steps. He retreated quickly. Linda laughed so hard she had to hold onto the doorframe. I've never seen you lose an argument to a chicken. Quang stared at the flock, breathing heavily. They planned this. She laughed again, softer this time. You did great. By late morning, he moved to the garden. He dug the soil carefully, planted seedlings one by one, watered each row slowly. Dirt clung to his hands and sleeves. Sweat gathered at his temples. Linda sat nearby on a low stool, watching quietly. When he paused, she handed him water. Careful, she said, offering a towel. He wiped his face and looked at her. You're smiling a lot today. She blinked. Am I? Yes. She thought for a moment. I guess I am. They sat together on the steps when he finished. The house felt full, not of noise, but of presence. You don't have to do anything today, he said. Just laugh. Linda leaned her head against his shoulder. That might be the hardest job, she said softly. He smiled. Then I'll keep working. She laughed again, easy and unforced, and this time it didn't feel fragile. It felt steady. It felt real. The afternoon unfolded without urgency. The sun moved higher, then slowly began its descent, softening the light that spilled across the yard. The air warmed just enough to feel comforting instead of heavy. The house seemed to breathe easier as the day settled into itself. Linda rested on the couch near the open window, a light blanket draped loosely over her legs. She wasn't sleeping, just resting, letting her body decide its own rhythm for once. Outside, she could hear Quang moving around, his footsteps steady, familiar. She watched him through the window. He moved from one task to another with quiet focus. There was no rush in him today, no phone pressed to his ear, no schedule pulling him elsewhere. Just small responsibilities, handled one by one, as if each of them mattered. He swept the yard slowly, pausing now and then to pick up leaves by hand. He stopped to adjust a loose board near the fence. He checked the water containers, lifting them carefully, testing their weight. Linda smiled without realizing it. She felt strangely light. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was demanding anything from her in that moment. When Quang stepped inside, the sound of the door made her turn her head. You should be resting, he said gently, noticing her watching him. I am, she replied. I'm supervising. He smiled. Important job. He poured her a glass of water and placed it on the table within reach, then hesitated for a moment. Are you hungry? She thought about it. A little. I'll make something light. You already cooked today. That just means I'm warmed up. She laughed softly and settled back into the couch as he moved into the kitchen again. This time, There was less noise, fewer mistakes. His movements were calmer, more confident. He chopped vegetables slowly, carefully, like he wasn't trying to impress anyone, just trying to do it right. Linda watched him from where she sat. It struck her how rare this version of him felt. Not the man who carried weight on his shoulders, but the one who paid attention to small things. The way he rinsed his hands longer than necessary. The way he tasted the soup and adjusted it without frustration. The way he glanced at her now and then, just to check. "Why are you staring?" he asked without looking up. "I'm not staring," she said. "I'm observing." He glanced over his shoulder. "You look suspiciously amused." "Maybe I am." He brought the bowl to her a few minutes later and sat beside her instead of across the room. They ate quietly, not the uncomfortable kind of silence, the easy kind, the kind that didn't need to be filled. "This is good," she said after a few bites. "Good enough? More than enough." He leaned back slightly, satisfied. The afternoon passed slowly after that. Linda dozed lightly, waking now and then to the sound of Quang moving nearby. Each time she opened her eyes, he was there, folding clothes, organizing shelves, fixing small things she hadn't even noticed were broken. At one point, she laughed out loud. "What?" he asked. "I just realized I haven't lifted a finger all day." "That's the point. I'm not used to this." He sat on the arm of the couch. "Get used to it." She looked at him, expression soft. "You're spoiling me." He shrugged. "I don't see the problem." As evening approached, the light shifted again, turning golden, then slowly fading. The temperature dropped just enough to make the air feel crisp. Quang stepped outside to light the stove near the porch. The smell of dinner drifted through the open door. Linda wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and watched the sky change color. For the first time in a long while, her thoughts didn't race ahead. They stayed where she was, right there, on the couch, listening to familiar sounds. When dinner was ready, Quang helped her up and guided her to the table. "You're treating me like I'm fragile," she teased. "I'm treating you like you matter." She didn't joke after that. They ate slowly, sharing small comments, smiles, observations about nothing important. A breeze moved through the open door, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. After dinner, they sat outside. The yard was quiet now. The chickens had settled. The garden rested in the dim light. Stars began to appear, one by one, faint but steady. Quang leaned back in his chair. "Today was good." "It was," Linda said. She reached for his hand without thinking. He intertwined his fingers with hers easily, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I laughed a lot," she added. "I noticed. I forgot how much I missed that." He squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to forget again." She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed like that, not speaking, listening to the night settle around.
Xin chào mọi người. Trong tập này, Linda và bà Linda và Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an sự và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Qua Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.